The planet of Zaloria, once a thriving world of lush green forests, sparkling blue rivers, and peaceful skies, was now a place of fear and desperation. The alien race that called Zaloria home, known as the Zorathians, had always been peaceful. For centuries, they had lived in harmony with their planet, never once needing to raise a weapon or defend themselves against any outside force. Their way of life was simple but meaningful. They believed in balance, in sharing knowledge, and in creating alliances across the stars. They had never known conflict, never known the horrors of war. But all of that was about to change. It started slowly, almost unnoticed at first. Small skirmishes along the planet's border. Then, the first wave of enemy ships appeared in the sky, dark silhouettes against the sun. The Zorathians thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a group of travelers or explorers passing through their system. But as the days went on, the ships grew larger, more numerous, and more threatening. The enemy was here, and they weren't interested in peace. The invaders were not like any species the Zorathians had encountered before. They were brutal, relentless, and their weapons were unlike anything the Zorathians had seen. At first, the Zorathians tried to communicate, to reason with the invaders. They sent emissaries, hoping for a peaceful solution. But the enemy was not interested in diplomacy. They came for one thing only, to conquer. They attacked without mercy, and their ships blazed across the sky, releasing waves of energy that decimated the Zorathian cities. The once thriving civilization was now reduced to rubble. The Zorathians fought back, but their defenses were no match for the invaders. Their advanced technology was built for exploration and knowledge, not warfare. The military forces they had were minimal, not trained for battle, and their weapons were designed for defense, not for taking down an enemy with no mercy. In the span of just a few days, the enemy wiped out their strongest cities and left a trail of destruction in their wake. The Zorathians were no longer just fighting for their homes. They were fighting for their survival. The Zorathian Council, composed of their wisest and most respected leaders, gathered in their underground chambers. Their faces were grim, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were facing certain extinction. There was no way they could defeat the enemy on their own. The battle was already lost. Their only hope now lay in something they had never considered before. They had to ask for help. The council debated long into the night, their voices tense and filled with fear. They had never once sent an SOS to the galaxy. They had always relied on diplomacy, peaceful discussions, and their reputation as a gentle, wise people. But the enemy was unlike any they had encountered, and time was running out. The invaders were closing in on their last stronghold. If they didn't act quickly, they would be wiped from existence, their entire species erased from the galaxy. One of the council members, an elder named Leris, stood and spoke with a heavy heart. "We have no choice," she said softly. "We have always prided ourselves on our peaceful ways. We have never needed to ask for help, but now we must. We cannot survive this alone. We need to send an SOS." The council fell silent, each member grappling with the gravity of her words. The Zorathians had always believed they could solve any problem through peace, through understanding. Asking for help was a sign of weakness, something they had never considered. But now, it was the only option. The enemy was unstoppable, and without assistance, the Zorathians would fall. Leris continued, her voice filled with sorrow. "We will send a message to the stars. We will ask for aid. We do not know who will hear us, or if anyone will answer. But it is our only hope." The decision was made. They would send the SOS, a desperate plea for help. They would broadcast it across the galaxy, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, would respond. The message would be simple, but its meaning would be clear. "We need help. We cannot survive this alone." The Zorathian Council worked quickly, crafting the message that would go out to the galaxy. They used all the technology they had left, their most advanced communication systems, and sent the message into the stars. The words would travel far and wide, hoping to reach any race capable of offering assistance. The message was broadcast in every language the Zorathians knew, translated for every possible race in the galaxy. "We are the Zorathians. Our world is under attack. We are being destroyed. We need help. Once the message was sent, the council waited. They knew it was a long shot, that the chances of receiving help were slim. The galaxy was vast, and who would hear the cry of a peaceful species like theirs? Who would answer an SOS from a race that had never once asked for assistance? The Zorathians sat in silence, staring at their communication screens, hoping for a sign, any sign, that their message had been received. As the hours turned into days, the situation on Zaloria grew worse. The enemy continued to advance, relentlessly tearing through the Zorathian defenses. The survivors retreated to the last stronghold, hoping to make a stand, but they knew it would only be a matter of time before the enemy overwhelmed them completely. The hope that someone would respond to their SOS was fading with each passing hour. But just as the Zorathians were preparing for the inevitable, something changed. A signal came through. It was faint at first, almost impossible to detect, but it was there. A response. The council rushed to their communication systems, their hearts pounding. It was a strange, unfamiliar signal, one they couldn't quite decipher, but it was unmistakable. Someone had heard their cry for help. The council listened carefully, unsure of what to expect. The voice on the other end was distorted at first, but they could make out a few words. Help, on the way. The transmission cut out abruptly, but it was enough. Someone had heard their plea, and help was on the way. The Zorathians couldn't believe it. After days of despair, after all the suffering, there was a glimmer of hope. Someone had answered their SOS. But who were these mysterious beings? What kind of help could they offer? And what would the price of their assistance be? The Zorathians didn't know, but for the first time in days, they felt a flicker of hope. As the message ended, the council exchanged uneasy glances. The enemy was still advancing, and time was running out. But now, they had a chance. A slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. The Zorathians had reached out to the galaxy, and someone had heard their cry. The real question was, would the help they had received be enough to save them, or would it be too late? The tension was unbearable. The fate of the Zorathian race was no longer in their hands alone. They had sent out their plea, and now they could only wait and pray that the help they so desperately needed would arrive in time. The Zorathians waited, their hearts heavy with both fear and anticipation. As the faint signal they had received faded into static, they could only hope that the message had reached the right ears. The enemy was relentless, advancing with terrifying speed, and every passing hour brought them closer to the final destruction of the Zorathian cities. Their world, once a peaceful haven, was now a battleground. The council sat in silence, their faces drawn and tired, as they listened intently to the communication systems. The faint signal they had received had given them a glimmer of hope, but it was too brief, too cryptic to offer any real reassurance. They had no idea who had responded to their call for help or when, if ever, they would arrive. All they knew was that the help they so desperately needed might be on the way, but they couldn't be sure. Time seemed to slow as they waited. The sky outside their chamber grew darker, and the sound of distant explosions echoed across the land, reminding them of the war that had already claimed so much of their world. The once beautiful cities of Zaloria were now little more than crumbling ruins. The fields, which had once been teeming with life, were now scorched and lifeless. There was no place left to run, no place left to hide. The Zorathians had been pushed to the brink of extinction, and yet, they clung to the fragile hope that someone, somewhere, would answer their cry. In the midst of their despair, the council members turned their attention to the only thing that could save them: the unknown saviors who had promised to come. A transmission had been sent, but there was no way of knowing when or how the help would arrive. The thought of relying on a mystery, on beings they had never met, was unsettling, but it was the only option they had left. Then, as the hours stretched on, a new transmission came through. This time, the signal was stronger, clearer. A voice broke through the static, unfamiliar yet filled with an unmistakable authority. The council gathered around the communication station, their hearts racing. Was this the help they had been waiting for? The voice, though distant, was calm and precise. "This is Commander Ruck of the Deathworlder fleet. We've received your SOS. Help is on the way. A wave of relief washed over the Zorathian leaders, but it was quickly replaced with confusion. Deathworlders? They had never heard of such a race. What kind of beings were they? What did the name Deathworlders even mean? The name alone sent a shiver down the Zorathian spines. They had imagined peaceful allies, beings who would come to their aid with compassion and wisdom. But the word Deathworlder spoke of something entirely different. The voice continued. Our fleet will be arriving shortly. We are equipped for battle. Prepare yourselves. The message was short, direct, and left no room for misunderstanding. The Deathworlders were not coming to negotiate peace. They were coming to fight. The Zorathians had no illusions now. They were not going to be rescued by diplomats or wise sages. They were going to be saved by warriors. The council exchanged worried glances. This was not what they had expected. The Zorathians had always prided themselves on their peaceful ways, on their ability to solve problems through dialogue and understanding. They had never imagined that their salvation would come at the hands of a race so aggressive. But now, they had no choice. If the Deathworlders could defeat the invaders, then that was all that mattered. Laris, the elder councilwoman, spoke up first. We asked for help, and help is coming. It may not be what we imagined, but we cannot afford to question it. The enemy is still advancing. We must prepare to meet these beings, these Deathworlders, and trust that they will do what they have promised. Her words, though spoken with authority, did little to ease the growing unease in the council chamber. The Zorathians had been forced into a corner, and now, they had no choice but to accept help from these mysterious warriors. Their world was at the mercy of strangers who seemed as likely to destroy as they were to save. As the council made preparations, a new wave of fear began to settle over the planet. The Zorathians had never fought before, and now, they were going to have to fight, not only to survive but also to trust the very beings who had promised to save them. There was no going back. Meanwhile, the Deathworlder fleet made its way towards Zaloria. The Zorathians watched anxiously as the skies darkened, anticipating the arrival of their unknown saviors. As they looked up at the distant horizon, the shadows of the fleet grew larger. Massive warships, unlike anything they had ever seen, filled the sky. The Zorathians could only watch as the fleet closed in. These ships weren't the sleek, peaceful vessels they had envisioned. They were dark, imposing, and designed for one purpose: war. They were a reminder that, in the universe, survival often came at the cost of peace. The Zorathians had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but they were about to face the grim reality of warfare. The Deathworlders had come to fight, not to negotiate, and the Zorathians were now caught in the middle of a conflict they had never imagined. As the fleet landed on the surface of Zaloria, the Deathworlders began to disembark. The Zorathians had no choice but to prepare themselves for what was to come. They were saved, but what kind of salvation would this be? Would they be grateful for the help, or would they become slaves to their saviors? The silence that followed the arrival of the Deathworlders was deafening. The Zorathians, once peaceful and unarmed, now stood face to face with beings from a distant and dangerous world. These were warriors who lived by a different code, a code the Zorathians had never known. And as the Zorathian leaders watched them approach, they realized that their world would never be the same. The help they had received was not without cost, and the price of survival was about to become painfully clear. The Deathworlders were here. But what kind of future would they bring to the Zorathians? Would they be the saviors they hoped for, or would they become just another force in the galaxy to be feared and controlled? Only time would tell. The Zorathians had no choice but to place their fate in the hands of these mysterious warriors. They had sent an SOS, and now, they were about to find out if they had made the right choice. The Deathworlder fleet hovered over Zaloria, their massive warships casting long shadows across the planet's surface. The Zorathians stood in awe, unable to fully comprehend the scale of the force that had just arrived. The ships were unlike any they had ever seen, dark and menacing, with sleek metallic hulls that reflected the dying light of the sun. The hum of energy coursing through the ships was a constant reminder of the power they held. Ruck, the commander of the Deathworlder fleet, stood at the front of the landing party. His imposing figure towered over the Zorathian leaders, his cold eyes scanning the gathered crowd with the efficiency of a seasoned warrior. His armor was battle-worn and scratched, bearing the scars of countless battles across the galaxy. Every movement he made was calculated, deliberate, and filled with the authority of someone who had led troops into combat more times than he could count. The Zorathians had hoped for something different, perhaps a fleet of peaceful diplomats, beings who would offer their wisdom and knowledge. But what stood before them was a force of nature, a relentless power that made no attempt to disguise its purpose. The Deathworlders were not here to negotiate or offer guidance. They were here to fight. "Prepare yourselves," Ruck's voice boomed, his tone unwavering. "The enemy is still here, and they won't wait for us to get ready. We fight now, or we perish. There is no other option." The Zorathian council members exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen a leader like Ruck, someone who spoke with such certainty and authority. The reality of their situation was sinking in. They were no longer in control. The Deathworlders had come to save them, but at what cost? There was no mention of peace, no offer of protection. The Deathworlders were here to destroy the invaders, but in doing so, they would be forcing the Zorathians into a world they had never known: war. The Zorathians had always been a race of thinkers, of scholars, and diplomats. Their strength lay in their ability to communicate and understand, not in their ability to fight. They had never needed to wield weapons, never had to prepare for battle. Now, they were being thrust into a world where survival was measured in bloodshed and violence. Laris, the elder of the council, stepped forward hesitantly, her voice calm but filled with the weight of the moment. "Commander Ruck," she began, "we are grateful for your arrival, but we are not soldiers. Our people have never fought like this. We don't know how." Ruck's gaze didn't soften. He had heard similar words from countless other civilizations he had helped, but he had no patience for such sentiments. "You don't have to be soldiers," he said flatly. "You just need to survive. You need to follow orders, and you need to fight when the time comes. The rest will follow. I'm here to ensure you stay alive. That's the only thing that matters." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. There was no negotiation. There was no time for hesitation. Ruck's mission was clear: to save the Zorathians from extinction, but to do so on his own terms. And those terms were harsh. They would be forced into a conflict they had never wanted, and they would owe everything to the Deathworlders. Laris stood silently, trying to process the gravity of the situation. She had fought for peace her entire life, believing that there was always a way to resolve conflict without bloodshed. But now, standing in front of a being who was more warrior than diplomat, she understood that peace was a luxury they no longer had. The Zorathians were caught between two brutal realities: the destruction of their world and the harsh reality of survival through force. "How do we fight?" another council member asked, his voice filled with fear. "We don't know how to wage war." Ruck didn't hesitate. "You learn. We'll teach you. I'll train your people, and we'll make soldiers of them. You don't have to be born a warrior to survive. You just need to do what it takes when the time comes. The enemy is ruthless, and they won't show mercy. Neither can you." The council members exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them could argue with the logic. Ruck had made it clear that survival was the only option. The enemy would show no mercy, and if the Zorathians didn't fight, they would perish. There was no turning back now. The training began immediately. The Deathworlders, true to their word, began to show the Zorathians how to defend themselves. They started with the basics: how to hold a weapon, how to stand, how to move. The Zorathians were not natural fighters. Their muscles were not built for combat. Their reflexes were not honed by years of battle. But they had to learn quickly, and the Deathworlders wasted no time in pushing them to their limits. Lyra, the young Zorathian girl who had never held a weapon in her life, was among the first to be thrust into training. She struggled at first, her hands shaking as she gripped the unfamiliar weapon. The weight of it felt unnatural in her hands, and the thought of using it against another being filled her with dread. But the Deathworlders didn't give her time to hesitate. They pushed her, urging her to fight her fear and learn quickly. "You won't survive if you hesitate," a Deathworlder instructor barked at her. You move when I say move, and you don't think. You strike first, or you die. That's how it works out here. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the instructor's commands, her body stiff with tension. She was a peaceful being by nature, and the thought of fighting, of hurting someone, felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever believed in. But she couldn't afford to think about it. She had no choice but to learn. The stakes were too high. As the days passed, the Zorathians grew more accustomed to the Deathworlder methods. They trained relentlessly, day after day, learning how to fight with the same deadly precision that had made the Deathworlders feared across the galaxy. But there was no joy in it. There was no sense of triumph. Every Zorathian felt the weight of what they were being forced to become. They were losing their innocence, their identity, and they knew that their survival would come at a price far higher than they had ever imagined. And still, the Deathworlders were relentless, pushing the Zorathians harder, demanding more from them, all while the battle for their planet raged on. The skies were filled with the sound of warships and the roar of battle, and the Zorathians knew that there was no going back. They had sent out their SOS for help, and now they had to face the reality of what that help meant. They were no longer the peaceful people of Zaloria. They were soldiers, and their fate was now in the hands of the Deathworlders. The only question now was whether they would survive, or whether the cost of survival would be too much to bear. The battle for Zaloria had begun, and with it, the true weight of the Zorathians' new reality settled in. They had sent out an SOS in desperation, and now the Deathworlders were leading them into a war they had never wanted. The Zorathians, once a peaceful race that lived in harmony with their planet, now found themselves armed and trained, standing side by side with these battle-hardened strangers. The air was thick with tension as the enemy's forces drew closer to their last stronghold. Ruck, the Deathworlder commander, stood at the front of his troops, observing the final preparations for the assault. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the battlefield ahead. He had seen countless wars, fought in battles across the galaxy, and he knew the importance of this fight. The Zorathians were counting on him, but Ruck cared little for their survival beyond the immediate threat. To him, they were simply another species to protect, to preserve for as long as it served his purpose. Do not falter, he instructed his soldiers, his voice a harsh command that echoed through the battlefield. We fight to win, not for honor. This is survival, and nothing more. The Zorathians, standing behind their new allies, felt a mixture of fear and determination. They had no experience with war, yet here they were, poised to fight to protect the last remnants of their world. For Lyra, the young Zorathian girl who had been thrust into this brutal reality, it felt like she was walking through a nightmare. Every day, her hands shook as she held a weapon, an object of destruction, one that she had never imagined using. But the Deathworlders had trained her, taught her how to move, how to fight, and how to survive. There was no time to hesitate, no time to question. She had to follow orders or die. As the Zorathians prepared for battle, Ruck's voice cut through the air, commanding attention. Today, we make our stand. The enemy is here, and they will not show mercy. But neither will we. Hold your ground, and fight like you've never fought before. The Zorathian council members stood in the back, watching with wide eyes as their people, once peaceful and unarmed, lined up alongside the Deathworlders. The council had long debated the decision to accept help from these ruthless warriors, but now, they had no choice but to trust them. They could only hope that the Deathworlders' strength would be enough to repel the enemy and save their world. As the battle began, the sky darkened with the roar of the Deathworlder ships, their weapons firing in quick succession, targeting the invaders' forces. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The Zorathians, armed and trained, rushed forward with their new allies, their fear tempered by the knowledge that their planet, their entire existence, hung in the balance. They fought with a mix of determination and desperation, each Zorathian fully aware that this might be their last stand. Lyra moved with the others, her weapon raised, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hardly recognize herself anymore. The girl who had once dreamed of peace was now a soldier, fighting to protect everything she had known. She felt her body tense with every movement, every step. She had never fought before, but now, she was learning what it meant to be part of something much larger than herself. She fought, not just for her planet, but for the chance to live, to have a future beyond the war. The battle raged on, and the Zorathians were pushed to their limits. Despite the Deathworlders' overwhelming firepower, the enemy forces were still strong. They had underestimated the invaders' persistence, and the war began to feel like a fight against time itself. The Zorathians, though terrified, fought with all their strength. They had no choice. If they didn't win, they would lose everything. Hours passed, and the line between victory and defeat grew thinner. Ruck remained unmoved, commanding his troops with ruthless efficiency. He had been through this countless times before, and for him, this was just another battle, another world to conquer, another people to fight for. But as he watched the Zorathians in the heat of battle, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of respect. They were not warriors by nature, but they fought with everything they had. They had come to trust the Deathworlders, and now, they were fighting side by side. There was a kind of raw determination in them, something that Ruck had seen in few other races. Lyra, her body battered and bruised, pressed on, the weight of the weapon now familiar in her hands. She had learned so much in such a short amount of time. How to shoot, how to fight, how to move without hesitation. But it didn't make the reality of the battle any easier. She was still the same person, the same girl who had once known only peace. But now, she was learning the cost of survival. She fought because she had no choice. She fought because her people needed her, and because if they didn't, the invaders would finish what they had started. As the battle reached its peak, the Deathworlders' overwhelming strength began to turn the tide. The enemy's forces, once confident in their superiority, started to retreat, faltering under the relentless assault. The Deathworlders, relentless in their pursuit, pushed forward with a vengeance, cutting down the invaders without mercy. It was a victory, one that had come at a tremendous cost, but it was a victory nonetheless. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was quiet, save for the distant sounds of collapsing structures and the cries of the wounded. The Zorathians, though exhausted, stood victorious. They had survived, but at what cost? The Deathworlders had saved them, but they had been forced to fight in a way they never thought possible. The Zorathian leader, Leris, surveyed the scene, her heart heavy. Their planet had been saved, but they had lost something more in the process. Their innocence, their sense of peace, was gone. They had fought, and they had won, but the cost of survival was now etched into their souls. They were no longer the same people they had once been. As Ruck stood before them, watching the Zorathians regroup, he spoke with his usual calm authority. This is just the beginning. The galaxy is not kind to the weak. You've learned how to survive today, and that is the only thing that matters. Leris, looking out at her people, knew that the Deathworlders had kept their promise. They had helped them survive. But the question that lingered in her mind was whether the Zorathians would ever be able to return to the peaceful ways they had known. Survival was now their reality, and the future was uncertain. What would happen when the Deathworlders left? Would the Zorathians ever be able to reclaim their world, their identity, or were they now bound forever to the warriors who had saved them? The answers were unclear, and the weight of the unknown pressed down on the Zorathians' shoulders. The battle was won, but the real fight was only just beginning. The dust from the battle had barely settled, and already, the Zorathians could feel the heavy weight of what they had endured. Their planet, scarred by war, was still alive, but barely. The Deathworlder fleet, having driven the invaders away, remained. The skies above Zaloria were filled with the unmistakable presence of the black warships, their engines humming with power. The Zorathians had survived, yes, but they had been transformed in the process. They were no longer the peaceful, thoughtful beings they once were. They had been made to fight, and they had learned, in the harshest possible way, that survival often came at a steep price. Ruck, the Deathworlder commander, stood at the forefront of the battlefield, surveying the aftermath. His warriors moved through the remains of the invaders' forces, ensuring there were no survivors left to regroup. For the Deathworlders, the mission was clear: eliminate the threat. For the Zorathians, however, the victory felt hollow. They had won, but they had lost something far greater in the process. Their innocence, their peaceful way of life. Lyra, now covered in dirt and blood, stood beside the Deathworlders, her hand still gripping the weapon she had never thought she would use. She had fought alongside these terrifying beings, had been taught to kill by them, and now, as she looked at the lifeless bodies scattered around the battlefield, a deep sense of sorrow washed over her. She had survived, but she couldn't escape the growing feeling that something vital had been taken from her, something she would never get back. She looked around, noticing how the other Zorathians, too, were struggling with the same emotions. They had fought for their homes, for their families, but they had also become something they never wanted to be: soldiers. And soldiers, as Ruck had made clear, were tools of survival. There was no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. Survival was the only law. As the last of the invaders were cleared from the battlefield, Ruck approached the Zorathian leader, Leris. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was firm, as always. "You've done well," Ruck said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your people fought with determination. But this isn't over. You have won this battle, but the war goes on. You may have a moment of peace, but don't let it fool you. You are at war now, whether you like it or not." Leris met his gaze, her face a mixture of gratitude and pain. She had never wanted to be a part of this violent world, and yet here she was, leading her people through it. "We are grateful for your help," she said, her voice steady. "But this war, it has changed us. My people were never meant for this kind of life." Ruck's expression softened, but only slightly. "Change is inevitable. The universe does not care about your ideals or your peaceful ways. You can either adapt or die. This is the reality of survival." His words hit her harder than she expected. The Zorathians had never lived in a world so harsh. They had never known what it was like to be hunted, to fight to stay alive. But now, in the face of the Deathworlders' brutal wisdom, they were forced to confront the ugly truth. Peace could not save them. Only power, force, would ensure their survival. As Ruck walked away, his soldiers moving to regroup and prepare for the next phase of their mission, Leris looked at her people. They had survived, yes, but they had lost something along the way. Their world, once filled with beauty and harmony, was now tainted with the scars of battle. The Zorathians were forever changed, and they could never return to the lives they had once known. The next few days were a blur of activity. The Deathworlders set up camp in the capital city, their warships looming over the skyline. They began training the Zorathians more intensely, preparing them for whatever came next. The Zorathians learned quickly. They had no choice, but the process was painful. They were taught how to fight, how to defend, how to kill. The peaceful philosophers and diplomats who had once populated Zaloria were now soldiers, their hands stained with the blood of enemies and allies alike. Lyra had become a reluctant leader among the younger Zorathians, guiding them through the harsh lessons and the difficult emotions that followed. She could see the fear in their eyes, fear not just of the Deathworlders, but of themselves. They had become what they had never wanted to be, and they didn't know how to cope with that reality. One evening, after another grueling day of training, Lyra found herself alone in a quiet corner of the city, looking out at the stars. The sky, once a source of comfort, now seemed distant and cold. She remembered the days when she had dreamed of traveling the stars, learning from other civilizations, experiencing the vast beauty of the galaxy. But now, she felt lost. She had no idea what the future would hold, only that survival was all that mattered. A figure approached, breaking her thoughts. It was Ruck, his silhouette outlined by the dim light of the evening. "You're troubled," he said, his voice like gravel, as he stood beside her, looking out at the ruined city. Lyra didn't answer right away, but she couldn't shake the bitterness in her heart. "I don't want this," she finally said, her voice filled with pain. "I never wanted to be a soldier. I never wanted to fight." Ruck's gaze didn't shift. "None of us do. But in this galaxy, fighting is often the only choice. You can either fight and survive, or you can stand aside and die. The universe is full of death, and it doesn't care about your intentions." His words stung, but she knew they were true. "What happens after the war is over?" she asked, her voice soft. Ruck's expression softened ever so slightly, but his answer was blunt. "You live. And you make sure the cost of survival was worth it." The silence stretched between them as Lyra thought about his words. She had asked for peace, for salvation, and in return, she had found herself in a world of war, where survival was the only currency. She had been saved by the Deathworlders, but now, she had to ask herself, was survival enough? Could she accept this new life, this new identity? Could the Zorathians ever find their way back to what they had lost? Or were they now forever bound to a reality of battle and bloodshed? As the stars blinked overhead, Lyra realized that the true cost of survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. The Zorathians had been saved, but they had lost something much more precious in the process. Their peace, their innocence, and perhaps a piece of their soul. She wasn't sure if they would ever recover what they had lost. All she knew now was that the battle was far from over, and the future of her people was in her hands. The choices they made today would define the rest of their existence. And as Ruck's words echoed in her mind, Lyra knew that survival was not just a fight for their world. It was a fight for their very humanity. The days following the battle were filled with a tense stillness that seemed to settle over the Zorathians like a thick fog. The enemy had been defeated, but the victory felt hollow. The Deathworlders remained, their massive warships still looming above the city like a constant reminder of the price of survival. The Zorathians, though grateful for their assistance, were beginning to feel the weight of their dependence on these merciless warriors. Ruck had promised them survival, and in a way, he had delivered. The invaders were no longer a threat, and their cities, though scarred and broken, were still standing. But the Deathworlders had not left. They had not offered peace. They had offered nothing but the brutal assurance that the Zorathian survival was a transaction, and one they could never escape. Lyra had fought in the final battle alongside the Deathworlders, and now, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped in a world she didn't belong to. The Zorathians had been forced into this violent existence, and now, they had to live with the consequences. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? The Zorathian Council, led by Leris, convened again in their chambers, the weight of their situation pressing down on them with every passing day. They had made the decision to accept help from the Deathworlders, but now they were beginning to question whether they had made the right choice. How long will this last? Tarek, one of the younger council members, asked. His voice was filled with frustration and fear. "We're no longer the peaceful people we were. The Deathworlders have changed us. They've made us into soldiers. How can we go back to the way we were?" Leris sat quietly, her face grave. "I don't know," she admitted. "We've lost our innocence. But we're alive. That is all that matters right now. Our world was destroyed, and they came to our aid. But it's true, our way of life is gone. We cannot go back." Tarek clenched his fists in frustration. "But must we become them? Must we live by their rules, fight by their methods? We've been saved, but we've lost everything else. I don't want to live like this. I don't want to live as one of their tools." Leris nodded slowly, understanding the deep sadness in his words. "I wish I had an answer. I wish I could tell you that things will go back to the way they were, but I cannot. We cannot undo what has happened. All we can do now is survive and rebuild." But even as she spoke those words, Leris wasn't sure she believed them. The Deathworlders' presence was constant, and though their purpose was clear, to ensure the Zorathian survival, it was becoming increasingly clear that the price of that survival might be more than they were willing to pay. Over the next few days, the Zorathians continued their training under the watchful eyes of the Deathworlders. Ruck and his soldiers made sure the Zorathians were ready for anything, drilling them relentlessly in combat tactics, survival techniques, and, most importantly, the cold art of warfare. For the Zorathians, who had once known only peace and diplomacy, it felt like they were losing themselves in this new world of violence and bloodshed. Lyra, though she had grown accustomed to the harsh training, couldn't stop thinking about the world they had lost. She had seen so many things on the battlefield: death, destruction, and brutality. The Deathworlders had shown her how to survive, how to fight, but they had also shown her the ugly side of the universe. The side that didn't care about peace, about compassion, or about fairness. To the Deathworlders, survival was the only thing that mattered. One evening, after another grueling day of training, Lyra stood outside in the cool air, gazing up at the stars. They had always been a source of comfort for her, a reminder of the vast, beautiful universe beyond her world. But now, the stars seemed distant, cold. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by everything she had learned and everything she had lost. "You think too much," a voice said behind her. Lyra turned to see Ruck standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable, as usual. He had a way of appearing silently, like a shadow in the night. She had grown accustomed to his presence, though she had never quite understood him. He was a warrior, a leader, but he was also something more, something harder to define. And yet, despite everything, there was a strange connection between them. She didn't know if it was out of respect for his strength or a deeper, unspoken understanding of the cost of survival. "I can't stop thinking," Lyra replied, her voice quiet. "About what we've lost. About who we've become." Ruck didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, watching her as the stars twinkled above. After a long pause, he spoke again. "Survival changes everything. You asked for help, and we came. We didn't come to bring peace. We came to make sure you lived. But you're right. You've lost something. You've lost your peace, your innocence. But that's the price you pay for survival." Lyra's eyes narrowed, frustration creeping into her voice. "And what about you? What do you pay? Do you lose anything when you save others? Do you ever regret your wars?" Ruck's gaze remained steady, though his eyes flickered briefly with something Lyra couldn't quite read. "Regret is for those who have time to feel it," he said flatly. "I don't regret what I do. I do what's necessary. It's the only way to survive." Lyra was silent for a moment, digesting his words. The Zorathians had always lived in a world where survival didn't come at such a high price. Now, they had to live with the consequences of their decisions. They were survivors, but in becoming survivors, they had lost everything they had once stood for. "The Deathworlders," she said slowly, "they live like this all the time, don't they? This is their world. This is the price they pay. But I can't live like this." Ruck looked at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "You don't have to. But you do have to survive. You don't get to choose the cost. You only get to choose whether or not to pay it." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine, as though she had just glimpsed the harsh, unforgiving reality of the universe. She had asked for help, and she had been saved. But the cost of that salvation was more than she could have imagined. As she turned to leave, Ruck spoke once more. "Survival is not a gift. It is a debt, and you will pay it in one way or another." Lyra walked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. The battle was over. The Zorathians had survived. But the real fight, the one for their future, their identity, and their humanity, had only just begun. And in the distance, the Deathworlders' ships stood silent, watching over them, waiting for the next battle to begin. The battle had been won, but the war, if not for survival, then for something far deeper, was far from over. The Zorathians had been saved, but their world had changed forever, and so had they. The days following the conflict were filled with a heavy, haunting silence, broken only by the occasional clatter of Deathworlder soldiers preparing for the next phase of their mission. Ruck and his fleet of warriors had ensured the immediate survival of the Zorathians, but they were not about to leave just yet. The invaders had been repelled, yes, but the Zorathians were still a species in crisis. Ruck had made it clear from the beginning. Survival, while guaranteed for the moment, would come with strings attached. The Deathworlders had no intention of leaving anytime soon. The Zorathian Council convened in their war-torn chambers, weary and drained from the constant struggle of the past few weeks. Leris, their leader, looked out over the assembled members, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. They had survived, but at what cost? The Zorathians had been forced to become soldiers, to abandon everything they had once believed in. Their peaceful ways, their traditions, and their way of life, everything had been altered in the pursuit of survival. The Deathworlders have kept their word, Laris said, her voice quiet but firm. They've destroyed the invaders. Our planet is safe, for now. But they have also taken control of our world in ways we cannot undo. They've changed us. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. It was true. The Zorathians had been saved, but in doing so, they had been reshaped, molded into something they hadn't been before, a people who could fight. And what would happen when the Deathworlders finally left, as they inevitably would? Would the Zorathians even be able to return to the peaceful existence they had once known? Are we really ready to live like this? Tarek, the young council member, asked, his voice strained with frustration. Are we really ready to keep living under the shadow of these warriors, who view survival as a transaction, not a gift? Laris didn't answer immediately. She knew what Tarek was asking. The Deathworlders had promised them survival, but they had also made it clear that survival came at a price. And that price wasn't just material, it was spiritual, emotional. The Zorathians had been forced to change in ways they never thought possible. They were no longer the race they had once been. Their people, their culture, had been altered by the war. What do we do now? Another council member asked, his voice hesitant. What happens when the Deathworlders leave us? Will we be able to hold on to what remains of our world? Or will we be forever bound to them by the debt of survival? Laris stood, her gaze shifting from one council member to the next. She could see the fear in their eyes, the fear that came from knowing that they were no longer masters of their fate. I don't know, she said honestly. But we can't let fear define us. We've lost so much already. If we give in to that fear, we will lose what's left of ourselves. We need to rebuild. We need to show the Deathworlders that we are capable of standing on our own. The council members nodded, but their faces were still filled with doubt. Laris knew the road ahead would be difficult. The Zorathians had been given a chance at survival, but that didn't mean they could return to the life they once knew. There would be no going back to their peaceful existence. They had been forced to become soldiers, and they couldn't erase that from their souls. Outside the council chamber, the sounds of military activity could still be heard. The Deathworlders were continuing their relentless training, pushing the Zorathians harder each day. Their methods were brutal, and the Zorathians felt every moment of it. The once peaceful beings were now learning to fight with the same ruthless efficiency as the warriors who had saved them. It was a harsh truth, one they couldn't escape. Their world had been taken from them, and in exchange for their survival, they had been made to fight for it. Lyra had learned this the hard way. She had fought alongside the Deathworlders, had been pushed to the limits of her endurance, and now, as she stood on the training field, she realized something that made her heart ache. She was no longer the same person she had been before the war. She had seen too much, learned too much, and changed too much to ever return to the girl who had once dreamed of peaceful exploration. The Deathworlders stood around her, their faces as impassive as ever, watching her every move. Her weapon felt heavy in her hand, the weight of it more than just physical. It was a constant reminder of what she had been forced to become. You're thinking too much again, one of the Deathworlder trainers said gruffly, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Lyra looked up at him, trying to ignore the ache in her chest. I'm trying to understand what we've become. The trainer's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. You've become survivors. That's what matters now. Your old life is gone. You have to let that go, or it will destroy you. His words struck her like a blow. It was the truth, though it hurt to hear it. The Zorathians had once believed in peace, in cooperation. But now, they were learning the painful reality that survival required something else, something far darker, far more brutal. As Lyra continued her training, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the Zorathians. The Deathworlders had shown them the harsh realities of survival, but what would happen when the battle was over? Would they be able to reclaim what they had lost? Or were they forever bound to this new life, this new identity, that had been thrust upon them by the very beings who had saved them? In the distance, the Deathworlder warships remained, silent and watchful. The Zorathians had been saved, but their future was uncertain. They had learned how to fight, how to survive, but had they lost everything else in the process? The road ahead was long, and the questions of what it truly meant to be alive, to be free, hung heavily in the air. The battle may have been won, but the war for their souls had only just begun. The days following the battle felt like a slow march into a new world, one that the Zorathians had never imagined, and one they weren't sure they could survive in. The Deathworlder warships still loomed above their cities, casting long shadows over the now battered streets. Despite the victory, the Zorathians could feel the weight of the changes that had been forced upon them. They had been saved, but at what cost? The brutal reality of survival hung heavily on their shoulders, and as the Deathworlders remained, a lingering question persisted. Would they ever truly be free again? Lyra stood on the balcony of the Council's temporary headquarters, gazing out at the skyline of Zaloria. The planet she had known, green fields, vibrant cities, and peaceful skies, was no more. The landscape was scarred by the battle, the signs of destruction etched into every building, every tree. The Deathworlders had driven the invaders away, but they had left their mark on the world as well. And now, the Zorathians were left to pick up the pieces. They had been made to fight, and while they had survived, they had lost something more profound. Peace, innocence, and their former way of life felt like distant memories. The weight of the change was especially apparent among the younger Zorathians, those who had never known the horrors of war before. They had been thrown into battle, forced to learn how to survive in a world where survival meant becoming something they had never been. Soldiers. Lyra had once been one of them, someone who believed in the beauty of peace. Now, she carried a weapon without hesitation, her hands calloused from training and battle. But the cost of this survival was heavy. The Zorathians had been shaped by the Deathworlders, molded into something that was no longer entirely their own. They had learned how to fight, but they had also learned how to follow orders without question. There was no room for individuality, for the peaceful Zorathian way of life they had once cherished. The Deathworlders had taught them one thing above all else: survival came first. Everything else, morality, compassion, culture, came second. Lyra turned as the door behind her opened, and Leris, the leader of the Zorathians, stepped onto the balcony. The older woman's face was marked by exhaustion, but there was still a glimmer of determination in her eyes. She had led her people through the worst crisis in their history, and she had fought alongside them, but the cost had been undeniable. "How are you holding up?" Leris asked quietly, her voice reflecting the weight of the same burdens Lyra felt. Lyra shook her head slowly. "I don't know anymore. I look out there, and I don't see our world. I see what it's become, and I'm not sure we'll ever be the same." Leris sighed deeply, her eyes scanning the horizon as well. "We've lost much, but we've gained something, too. We're alive, and we've learned how to fight, how to survive in a universe that doesn't care about our peace." Lyra turned to face her, her voice filled with frustration. "But at what cost? We didn't ask for this. We didn't ask to be soldiers. We were just trying to live. Now we're nothing more than tools for survival. That's all we are." Leris placed a hand gently on Lyra's shoulder. "I know. Believe me, I know. We've been forced to change in ways we never imagined. But survival isn't something we can take lightly. We've learned that the hard way. The Deathworlders may have shown us how to fight, but we still have a choice in how we move forward." Lyra looked up at her, her heart heavy with doubt. What if we can't move forward? What if we've lost everything that made us who we were? Leris paused for a long moment, considering Lyra's words. "We haven't lost everything. The Deathworlders may have reshaped us, but we're still Zorathians. We still have the heart of who we are inside. We just have to find it again. And that will take time. We have to rebuild, not just our world, but ourselves." Lyra nodded slowly, the weight of Leris's words sinking in. The Zorathians had been reshaped, yes, but they were still a people with a rich history, a history that was more than just peace. They had once thrived because they understood balance. They understood the value of cooperation. They could still rebuild that. It would be hard, and it would take time, but they were not beyond saving. The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted her thoughts. Ruck, the Deathworlder commander, stepped into view, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. He had been silent in the aftermath of the battle, leaving the Zorathians to process their victory and loss on their own. But now, his presence was once again undeniable. "You've done well," he said gruffly, his voice breaking the silence like a hammer striking metal. "The enemy is gone, and you've held your ground. But this is not over. There is still much to be done." Lyra glanced at him, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. "What do you want from us now?" she asked, her voice sharp with underlying frustration. "We've done what you asked. We've fought. Now, will you leave us to rebuild, or will we remain under your control?" Ruck's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "I'm not here to control you," he said flatly. "I'm here to make sure you survive. You wanted help, and I gave it. But survival isn't a one-time deal. It's ongoing. You'll always need to be ready for the next fight, the next threat. And when that comes, you'll need to remember what you've learned. You'll need to remember how to fight." Lyra felt a surge of anger but held it in check. "We don't want to be warriors forever. We want to rebuild what we've lost. We want peace." Ruck's eyes bored into hers, his gaze unyielding. "Peace is a luxury. Survival is a necessity. And if you want to build peace, you need strength. You need to be ready to protect it. I've shown you how to survive. What you do with that knowledge is up to you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lyra and Leris standing in silence. The weight of his words lingered in the air between them, a constant reminder of the harsh reality they now faced. As the days passed, the Zorathians began to rebuild. Their cities were repaired, and new foundations were laid, but the scars of war remained. The Deathworlders, though they had ensured the Zorathians' survival, had not left. They remained a constant presence, guiding and teaching the Zorathians in the ways of battle, preparing them for whatever might come next. And though the Zorathians had come to accept their role as survivors, they could not shake the feeling that they had lost something essential. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the Zorathians would never be the same. They had been forced into a new reality, one that demanded they fight for their survival every day. And as they moved forward, rebuilding their world and their lives, they knew that the true cost of survival would continue to haunt them. The war may have been won, but the war for their soul, who they were and who they would become, was still ongoing.